Hello, everyone. It's Reverend Brian Jones. People have shared with me that sometimes during times of trouble, they go to church for a refuge from what's going on in the world. And some people look for tools to give them a better understanding or how to handle the world around them. And I just want to let you know up front that my sermon today is the latter. My thoughts have been directed directly what's going on in our city and in the world at large right now. And it heavily influenced this sermon, but I've tried to discuss these subjects in a way that is sensitive to my listeners, to be fully aware of the current times, but also provide tools that would not only help us for today, but tools that we can carry forward to tomorrow when things are going to be better for everyone. So I have three scriptures today, and the first comes from Jonah chapter 1, verses 4 through 17. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break it up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, and we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. The next scripture is John 18, verses 2 through 10. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. And Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you were looking for me, then let these other men go." And this happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of you that gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. And the third final scripture is from Mark chapter 4, verses 36 through 39. Now, when they had left the multitude, they took Jesus along in the boat, and other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling with water. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Then Jesus arose, and he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Thus ended the scriptures. Now, earlier this month, someone asked me, how can I work on spiritual development when it feels like I'm barely able to maintain myself right now? And my first thought was that with everything going on right now, your eyes are still searching for spiritual development. And therein lies the answer to your question. My advice was probably in retrospect a little simplistic because I told them to look at things as much as possible with a metaphysical eye. And this is what these three verses have in common with the important and challenging times we're facing today. Because when I look at a lot of the conflict around us, much of it documented on cell phone, I see lessons about how we respond. And what I mean by this is these lessons in the scripture, they describe the various ways we might react when confronting with situations beyond our control. And I love the rich allegory of Jonah. When faced with a storm, the ship's crew takes a few mitigating actions, but then ultimately looks for someone to blame. And of course, there's Jonah, who initially tries to separate himself from the storm. He beds down in the belly of the ship. He's divorced himself from the problem. But as Jonah soon learns, he can't just insulate himself from the problem around him. It eventually comes to him as the crew drags him to the deck. And let's consider John's description of the events in Gethsemane. Jesus had prepared himself for his arrest and the eventual events to follow. He's made peace with what would be overwhelming to me personally. But when Judas arrives with a coterie of soldiers, Simon Peter, who has spent the evening there with Jesus, defaults not to a peaceful response. He defaults to, instead, violence. And I like how Jonah's story is bookended in the New Testament with the third scripture. Jesus and the disciples are on a boat when a storm hits. The disciples are in a panic. And where is Jesus? Not hidden in the belly of the ship like Jonah. No, he's on the bow of the ship, that part that bears the brunt of the waves. And he's fast asleep. Jonah sought peace and safety hidden away from the storm. And Jesus instead found it while amidst the storm. And when aroused by his disciples, he quells the storm by facing it. You know, when I'm asked to describe divine metaphysics in a nutshell, I tend to say that what we're doing is we're trying to become pure vessels of God. I want to be a pure vessel of God. And the means to doing that, to being that, is by working on eliminating those aspects of our humanity that are incongruous with our divine nature. Now, as the Apostle Paul explains in 2 Corinthians, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. And just as John described later in Revelations, streets of gold so pure it's clear, I often think that should we not then try to purify our clay jars so that the treasure within radiates through and out? This, I recalled, was not too removed from the young Benjamin Franklin, who described in his autobiography how he set to paper a list of all his faults and then decided he was going to eliminate them one by one. Easy said, easy done, right? Because we're good, thoughtful, and considerate people, and we're trying to negotiate ourselves through this world with empathy, understanding, sympathy. And we strive to quote the early metaphysical writer Andrew Jackson Davis, we strive to keep, above all else, an even mind. Striving, above all else, to keep an even mind. But the world has this uncanny tendency, I think, because as we make our way innocently enough through life, we find ourselves challenged by unforeseen situations, sometimes mundane, sometimes monumental. And it's in these moments when we are caught off guard and our reactions or actions in those moments illuminate our nature, where we are versus where we think we are. And as I said earlier, I think the hallmark of this current time is the parade of videos showing people in situations who do not feel like they're in control, and they default to choices that escalate or perhaps devolve the situation. They devolve the situation from perhaps difficult to sometimes personally demeaning, and sometimes, to our great human sorrow, to criminal and life-taking. Now, recently, videos have captured these crossroad moments in gas stations, public parks, bike trails, the streets of our own city. And yes, when called out, some of those offending parties have doubled down on their choices. And some have offered the PR-crafted non-apology or tweet. But some, I honestly believe, have expressed what I think is genuine horror and shame at their choices during those moments. And in those crossroads, mundane and momentous, are our opportunities for spiritual development. When the COVID shutdowns began in March, I hired a personal trainer who was laid off from his gym. We would meet outdoors 3 times a week, and from a safe distance, he'd put me through what I believe are the toughest workouts I've ever had. And I've been to basic training and run 6 marathons. But in our first few sessions, the workouts, they would have me delirious and barely able to keep up. And in one of them, I spit on the ground. And there was a young family about 30 to 40 yards away, and the dad pushing a stroller and the mom wrangling their toddler. And they eventually made their way past us when I was about halfway through the next set of push-ups. The dad stopped and said to me, about as thoughtfully as one could, "You know, you shouldn't be spitting out here." And much to my great shame now, I dropped to my knees from my push-up position, and I said with what has to be grade A passive aggression, I said, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were so close. I thought you were further away. I totally respect the social distancing, and had I known you were 6 feet away or less, I would not have done it. I am so sorry. Well, as I already explained, they weren't 6 feet away. They were so far away that they could have veered off and avoided us entirely. Like I said, the father repeated calmly, "You shouldn't be spitting out here." And what did I do? I righteously doubled down on my passive aggressiveness and my adherence to 6 feet of social distancing. Just a short time later, when I was finally back home and had recovered from my workout, I was horrified because that dad was right. Not just because it's impolite to spit. Neither of my parents raised a public spitter. But what if his wife or one of their kids had had an autoimmune disease and this was their one safe space to get out of the house? What if I had spit on the ground and 5 minutes later a child had gone by and picked up a rock or pulled a dandelion that I had spit on? I didn't know my COVID status at the time, but what I did know was that when thrown the curveball of being politely corrected in public by a stranger, I didn't default to empathy. I defaulted to, how can I come across as being right? I even went on a mea culpa tour. I shared my story with some neighbors, and I even discussed it with my trainer at our next session, all of whom told me not to worry and that I didn't do anything wrong. But I knew the larger implication. About a week later, my trainer shared with me that a neighbor came and knocked on his door shortly before midnight because he was playing music too loudly. And now, come morning, he was embarrassed because while he did turn down the music, he was a bit of a snot about it. "You see," I said gently, "now do you understand why I rejected your assurances after the spitting incident?" He nodded. "And are you on friendly terms with your neighbor?" I asked. "I am," he said. "Then go to him and eat some generous crow. You know I've been looking for that family every day for 2 weeks. Don't waste this opportunity to do that easy act of healing, not just for your relationship with a neighbor, but for what you've seen in yourself." For those of you who don't know, I'm in the National Guard, and yes, I've been called up during this current crisis in our city of Washington, D.C. And as a leader, nearly my every waking thought has been towards the welfare of my soldiers. As their leader, I've seen the toll their formally ordered mission in the District of Columbia has been taken on them, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. The weight of their role in this city weighs upon them, and it's a city whose people, culture, and landscape we love, and we have tried to safeguard for the entirety of our National Guard careers. And so it was with great relief that I read this line in Politico magazine this morning. Specialist Isaiah Lynch said that as an African American, he was called a traitor by some protesters who cursed at him and also saw him as an oppressor of those protesting the cops. But the moment he will remember was when a man who had hit him with a brick the first day approached him a few days later to apologize. Now, many of you listening have heard me preach about what I call practical metaphysics. Practical in the sense that our faith is not just for the big scale. It's not just for the ultimate spiritual goal. Metaphysics is meant for the small moments. And our divine principles assure us that the doorway to reformation is never closed to us. And so it goes with life's crossroads, where a wrong turn illuminates aspects of our being that are not in accordance with our divine nature. And this is why there is hope in the examples in the scripture I shared earlier. Faced with conflict, Jonah fled and hid, but eventually made his way to Nineveh. Simon Peter draws first blood when the authorities approach, but Jesus heals the man and tells his errant disciple, "Shall I not drink from the cup my Father has set for me?" Jesus is prepared for the divine path before him and will not be diverted from it. And finally, in the example of Mark, Jesus awakes from the boat and dispatches the storm, chastising his disciples for letting their fear overshadow their faith. We can appreciate this story as a testament of Jesus' power over the weather and go no further. Or we can read it with metaphysical eyes and ask, how can I, in the face of the storm, proceed in faith and not fear? I'm convinced this happens through the application of divine metaphysics upon ourselves. We try to look at the crossroads with a metaphysical eye before taking that next step. But failing that, we can turn around and evaluate our choice from the other side. Again, how can we, in the face of the storm, proceed in faith and not fear? Through a lifetime of practice, not a lifetime of perfection. May you each be blessed with an open heart, an even mind, and abundant empathy today and every day after.